Behind the cold steel bars of the world's most secure prisons, thousands of criminals are locked away. Murderers, gang leaders, drug lords, people society fears the most. But even among these names, one man stands out as something far darker, far more dangerous. His name is Richard Lee, and both inmates and prison guards whisper his name with a chilling mix of fear and respect. Richard Lee isn't just another prisoner serving time. He is considered by many experts, investigators, and prison authorities as the most dangerous inmate alive today. The kind of man who doesn't just commit crimes, he changes the environment around him. Wherever Richard Lee is held, the atmosphere shifts. Guards patrol with their hands tighter on their weapons. Fellow inmates avoid direct eye contact. Every movement he makes is watched, and every word he speaks carries weight. But why is he so feared? Why is Richard Lee singled out among thousands of ruthless criminals? The answer lies in his unique story. A journey that begins not with one crime, but with a series of events that showed he wasn't like other offenders. From a young age, Richard displayed a level of intelligence, cold calculation, and lack of fear that unnerved those around him. Teachers described him as quiet, but unsettling. Neighbors said he always seemed to know more than he should. And by the time he reached his teenage years, Richard was already committing crimes that most hardened adults wouldn't dare attempt. What made him stand apart was not just his violence, but his control. Richard didn't just pull the trigger. He orchestrated events like a chess master, always thinking 5 moves ahead. Authorities believe this ability to manipulate situations is what turned him into a criminal mastermind. As he grew older, his crimes escalated, each one bolder, each one leaving investigators stunned at how perfectly executed they were. By the time he was finally caught, Richard Lee was no ordinary criminal. He was already a legend in the underground world, known for escaping impossible traps, outsmarting police forces, and leaving chaos wherever he went. Locking him up wasn't the end of the story. In fact, some say it was just the beginning inside prison. Most criminals lose their power. They're cut off from the outside world, stripped of influence. But Richard Lee was different. From the very moment he stepped behind bars, he seemed untouchable. Guards knew he had connections. Inmates sensed his dominance. Even the toughest gang leaders hesitated before crossing him. His reputation grew so strong that prison officials had to enforce special rules just for him. 24-hour surveillance, extreme isolation, and restrictions that only a handful of prisoners in history have ever faced. This is why Richard Lee isn't just another inmate. He is a living threat, a man whose influence and danger extend far beyond the prison walls. The real question isn't why he is feared. It's whether the world's most secure prisons can actually contain someone like him. And this is where his story begins. Richard Lee's rise through the criminal underworld wasn't a story of chance. It was calculated, deliberate, and executed with the kind of precision that left both allies and enemies stunned. Unlike most criminals who stumble into gangs or violence out of desperation, Richard approached crime as though it were an art form, a dark craft that he perfected with patience and intelligence. In the early stages of his criminal life, Richard avoided attention. He started small. High-value thefts, underground deals, and subtle manipulations that didn't make headlines but built him a reputation in the shadows. His ability to plan every detail meant his crimes almost never failed. Each successful operation gave him leverage. Each connection he made tightened his grip on the underground network. By his mid-20s, Richard was no longer just a criminal. He was a strategist. He didn't need to pull the trigger himself. He had people willing to do it for him. Witnesses spoke of how he could walk into a room filled with gang leaders, and somehow, by the end of the meeting, he was the one in control. His charisma wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet, unnerving, and deadly effective. It wasn't long before Richard began orchestrating crimes that shocked the public. Authorities linked him to armored truck heists that were carried out with military-level precision, high-profile kidnappings where the victims vanished without a trace, and even violent hits that left rival groups scrambling in fear. The media labeled him a ghost criminal, always present in the chaos but never leaving enough evidence to pin him down. What made Richard particularly dangerous wasn't just his brutality. It was his ability to think like law enforcement. He studied police methods, memorized patterns, and even recruited insiders who fed him information. Detectives who hunted him admitted that it often felt like Richard was watching them rather than the other way around. Every time they got close, he slipped away, leaving behind a mocking trail that made investigators question their own skills. But his power wasn't just in escaping capture, it was in building loyalty. Richard Lee was known to reward those who stood by him, sometimes with money, other times with protection. To his inner circle, he was more than a leader. He was untouchable. That kind of loyalty meant betrayal was rare, and when it did happen, the consequences were brutal enough to serve as warnings for everyone else. The turning point in his rise came when he orchestrated one of the most daring underworld coups in recent history. Rivals who underestimated him were crushed, their empires dismantled piece by piece until Richard emerged as the unchallenged figure in the shadows. From that moment, he wasn't just feared locally, he was recognized internationally. Law enforcement across borders began sharing intelligence, desperate to figure out how one man had managed to cause so much damage without ever being caught. This growing legend of Richard Lee, the mastermind, the ghost, the criminal who always seemed one step ahead, was what made his eventual capture so shocking. But little did anyone know, prison would not weaken him. Instead, it would prove just how dangerous Richard Lee truly was. When Richard Lee was finally captured, it wasn't because he made a mistake. It was because authorities threw every possible resource into one of the most relentless manhunts in modern history. International task forces, surveillance teams, undercover operatives, everyone was involved. His arrest wasn't the end of a chapter, it was a global event. For the first time, the ghost had been cornered. But even then, Richard refused to act like a man defeated. Witnesses at the trial recall how he sat in the courtroom, calm and collected, as though the proceedings were just another game he had already planned for. Prosecutors expected him to lash out or show fear, but instead, Richard analyzed every detail, studying the jury, memorizing the judge's rhythm, even smirking at investigators who had spent years chasing him. It was this lack of fear that unsettled everyone the most. When the guilty verdict was handed down, the judge made a rare public statement, declaring Richard Lee a danger not just to society, but to the very structure of justice. He was sentenced to life without parole in one of the most secure prisons in the world. But almost immediately, prison authorities realized Richard wasn't like any other inmate. From the moment he stepped inside, security was tightened. He wasn't placed in a normal cell block. He was sent to a specially designed isolation unit, a wing reserved only for the most unmanageable prisoners. His cell had reinforced steel, multiple cameras monitored him 24/7, and guards rotated every few hours so no one could form a pattern or fall under his influence. And yet, despite these measures, incidents began almost immediately. Guards reported finding coded notes that hinted at communication with the outside world, even though Richard had no access to regular mail or phones. Inmates whispered about him late at night, convinced that somehow he was still pulling strings beyond the prison walls. Then came the first violent incident. A guard, described as professional and disciplined, suddenly broke protocol and attempted to smuggle in contraband. He was caught and interrogated, and under pressure, admitted that Richard had convinced him to do it. No threats, no blackmail, just words. Richard had simply talked to him, carefully and patiently, until the man felt compelled to obey. This wasn't an isolated case. Over time, more and more staff reported feeling uneasy around him. Some described his presence as magnetic. Others called it terrifying. He didn't need to shout or fight. His quiet confidence was enough to bend people to his will. Authorities began rotating staff more frequently, placing strict limits on his interactions, and even restricting his movements inside the facility. But the most disturbing sign came when officials discovered that violence between rival gangs inside the prison was mysteriously connected to Richard. He had no direct contact with these groups, yet fights erupted in ways that seemed carefully timed and orchestrated. The message was clear. Even locked in a box, Richard Lee remained a threat. For the system, his capture was supposed to be a victory. Instead, it became a nightmare. They hadn't caged a criminal. They had given him a new battlefield, one where he could prove that even prison walls couldn't contain his influence. Inside prison, most inmates either adapt to the system or get crushed by it. They follow routines, obey orders, and slowly fade into the background. But Richard Lee? He turned prison into his personal chessboard. From day one, he studied everything: the guards, the cameras, the schedules, even the psychological weaknesses of those around him. He didn't waste time with brute force or loud rebellion. Instead, he played a slower, more dangerous game: control through influence. Inmates began to notice how Richard could get things others couldn't. A man who had no access to phones somehow managed to get messages passed to the outside. Someone in total isolation was still able to spark conflicts between rival gangs in the yard. It was as if Richard had invisible strings tied to the entire prison population, pulling them whenever he pleased. What shocked officials most was the way he turned guards into pawns. Richard didn't threaten them, he studied them. He knew who had money problems, who felt overlooked, who was insecure about their position. Then, with carefully chosen words, he gave them a sense of trust. He didn't ask for favors immediately. He planted ideas, slowly nurturing them until the guards thought it was their own decision. By the time they realized what had happened, they were already working for him. One former guard described his influence perfectly. Talking to him felt like stepping into a trap you didn't see until it was too late. He made you feel like he understood you better than anyone else. And then, before you knew it, you were doing things you swore you'd never do. Inside the inmate population, Richard's reputation grew even more terrifying. He never raised his voice, never showed anger, but his decisions carried more weight than fists or weapons. A simple glance from him could settle disputes. A quiet word could start wars. The prison gangs, usually unpredictable and chaotic, began aligning themselves with his will. Rival leaders who had once fought each other were suddenly working in coordination, all because Richard made them believe it was in their best interest. This influence extended beyond prison walls. Authorities intercepted messages that suggested Richard was still running criminal operations outside. Money was moving, deals were being struck, and violence was erupting in cities far from where he was locked up. All of it traced back to his hidden hand. To combat this, prison officials attempted extreme measures, cutting off his contact, restricting visitation rights, and even moving him to different facilities. But every transfer ended the same way. Within weeks, Richard had adapted, rebuilt connections, and established dominance all over again. It became clear that Richard didn't need weapons, freedom, or even physical presence to remain dangerous. His power was psychological, his weapon was manipulation, and his battlefield was the human mind. In a place designed to break people down, he was the one breaking the system apart from the inside. And this is why authorities, criminologists, and fellow inmates agree. Richard Lee isn't just a prisoner. He is a ruler inside a kingdom of concrete and steel, a man who proves that walls and bars can't cage influence. Richard Lee's story doesn't stop at the prison gates. His name has crossed borders, filled headlines, and sparked debates among criminologists and law enforcement agencies worldwide. To the media, he is a real-life villain, the kind of figure who blurs the line between myth and reality. To authorities, he is a nightmare that refuses to end, no matter how many walls they build around him. What sets Richard apart from other infamous inmates is scale. Most dangerous criminals are feared inside prison. Richard Lee is feared everywhere. His influence has been traced from inside his cell to criminal organizations thousands of miles away. Intercepted communications reveal that his words alone have sparked violent conflicts in places he has never even set foot. Intelligence agencies in multiple countries have been forced to share information because Richard's network doesn't stop at one nation's borders. It stretches across continents. Criminologists call him a perfect storm of traits: high intelligence, psychological manipulation, and complete lack of empathy. He doesn't act out of desperation or passion. He acts with surgical precision. That's what makes him so dangerous. Every move he makes is planned, calculated, and executed with chilling calm. Unlike impulsive killers or reckless gang leaders, Richard doesn't need chaos. He creates it with purpose. The question that terrifies officials is simple: can the system actually contain him? Maximum security facilities have tried, and each time, Richard has managed to twist the rules to his advantage. Even in solitary confinement, designed to strip prisoners of all power, he has managed to plant fear, spark violence, and bend people to his will. To the public, his story raises an uncomfortable truth. If someone like Richard Lee cannot be fully controlled by the justice system, then what does that say about the system itself? Are prisons truly built to contain the most dangerous minds? Or do men like Richard prove that influence is more powerful than steel and concrete? Some experts argue that Richard represents a new category of criminal, one whose danger isn't in physical violence, but in the ability to command, manipulate, and destabilize from within. They compare him to a virus, invisible, but capable of spreading destruction wherever he goes. The global fascination with Richard has only made him more infamous. Documentaries, news specials, and crime analysts continue to dissect his life, each trying to uncover what makes him so different. Yet, despite all the studies, one fact remains: no one has found a way to neutralize his influence. And so, Richard Lee's legend grows. He is the prisoner who bends the prison, the criminal who still runs operations without freedom, the man who forces the world to admit that sometimes locking someone away isn't enough. That is why Richard Lee is called the most dangerous inmate on Earth, not because of what he has done in the past, but because of what he is still capable of doing, even from behind the strongest prison walls mankind has ever built.